How to turn this mess and a nightmare into a 3D geometry using Blender and just a single add-in, all in under 30 minutes. I mean 1 minute, under 1 minute. Ready, set, go. I'm selecting the object, entering the edit mode and enabling statistics here so I know how many faces we have. Now I'm going to press the N key and use the quad remesher add-in. I'm going to talk about it a bit later, so don't worry. I'm going to type in more or less the amount of faces that we see in the statistics and I'm going to press remesh. And that's already done, to be honest. But to make it perfect, I'm going to select one of those highlighted edges, then Shift G, sharpness and Ctrl B to add a very nice bevel. Here in the bevel settings, I'm gonna add one more segment and change the shape to 1. Now exit the edit mode, right click, shade smooth, and to make sure it all looks perfect, I'm gonna press Ctrl 1, which will add subdivision surface modifier, and look at that, isn't it beautiful? So let's see if that technique works on a bit more complex shapes, because if it does, I think it will be a lifesaver to many of you. As you can see, I'm using the default Suzanne in Blender and 4 spheres, and 2 of those spheres are actually modified slightly to make things a little bit harder. And what's really great about the add-in is that we don't even have to merge those modifiers. I can just go ahead and press the remesh button. I'm gonna dig into the add-in settings later in the video, but for now just look at that and tell me how much time would it take you to do this manually, because I know it would be at least a day for me. And what I just have to do is selecting those sharp edges again, beveling them slightly, and double checking in the object mode if everything looks correctly with the subdivision surface modifier, and it does, and it's really so nice to look at. So what is this sorcery? The quad remesher add-in has been available for Blender for quite a while now, but it was mainly used for geometry cleanup in 3D scans and sculpting. Well, as you could see, it turns out it's pretty damn good for hard surface modeling as well. But here's the question, why would you even want your 3D mesh to be nice and clean in the first place? First of all, it shows you don't suck at 3D modeling and at least have the basic understanding of what you're doing. Second, just look at this 3D mesh. Isn't it simply nice to look at? But on the serious note, first, the better shading. If you plan using subdivision surface modifiers or smooth shading in general, clean 3D geometry is the only way to go. Second, it always works. No matter if you plan using your 3D model in Blender or any other application, the correct clean 3D geometry will never have any bugs and will always look correctly. Today, tomorrow, basically forever. And third, the texturing. With correct 3D mesh, it's 10 times, 10,000 times, 100 times easier to create seams for UV mapping, which is something that every 3D artist loves, right? So this is where add-ins like Quad Remesher come into play. It was developed by
Maxime Roucard,
who's a CG developer and also the creator of Z Remesher tool, firstly introduced in ZBrush. You can get the Quad Remesher Blender add-in for free and use it for a month, but I would strongly encourage you to buy it. It's really not that expensive and you get a lot of value for your money. The add-in installation is pretty straightforward, so I won't be covering it in the video, but now let's jump into a few tips that I really want to share. Tip number 1. The add-in does a pretty good job with just the default settings. For example, you can have a very dense 3D mesh and reduce the face amount to the value typed in here. And to preserve the smaller details, all you have to do is adjusting this slider to 100%. By unchecking this box, this is tip number 2, the add-in will usually add less faces to the number you've typed in, and by keeping it checked, it will try to keep all the curvatures from the original mesh, so it will add a few more faces. Tip number 3, try to prevent very spiky geometry. The add-in may sometimes have problems with detecting the edge loops around these areas. You know that happened if the edges of the remeshed model are not marked as sharp, just like in this area here. So one of the fixes, this is tip number 4, maybe cleaning up the Boolean geometry before you remesh it, just in those areas that are causing the problems. The other solution, tip number 5, is feeding the add-in with more information about the 3D shape you're working on, so just make the base geometry much denser. You will reduce the amount of faces later with the add-in anyway. Tip number 6, if you want to keep symmetry of your geometry, simply delete half of it before remeshing. The add-in won't break anything, and all you have to do is simply mirroring the geometry you have right now, removing the duplicated vertices, and flipping all the normals outside. And finally, tip number 7, if you want to support my channel, check out the Chocofor store. Maybe you need some 3D models for Blender, or check out my Blender courses. Maybe you want to learn a thing or two. And now, when you have the knowledge on how to create a perfect 3D geometry, check out my next video where I share over 20 tips on how to make your renderings instantly better. Enjoy.